Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on how policy can promote robust and resilient supply chains as part of a global framework. This is a follow-up to the October 22nd webinar by the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations on the challenges facing the drug supply chain in Europe. This time, we're going to be talking about the solutions to improving the supply chain globally. So we walked through the problems last time, and now we're going to talk about the solutions. I'm Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and I'm going to be guiding us through this session, where we'll be answering everything you ever wanted to know about drug shortages, but were too afraid to ask. Obviously, this discussion is being prompted by the coronavirus pandemic and the major concerns that were raised about access to medical supplies during the most chaotic phase of this crisis in the spring. Now, since then, concerns have subsided, but the problems are no less real. At our first event, we heard about what happened to medicine supply chains this spring in Europe, and also about coming plans for vaccine supply chain management and distribution. Now, since that first webinar, we've had some very promising news from Pfizer about a vaccine that could be 90% effective against the virus. Yesterday, the European Commission agreed to purchase up to 300 million doses. So, of course, we have the short-term concerns about how medical equipment and vaccine supply chains are going to work in the coming months. And then we have the long-term concerns over drug shortages, which this crisis has exposed. There's a lot of different vaccines out there. And as we look at the supply chain going ahead in the coming months, it's obviously coming into increasing focus. And it's an excellent time to ask, what policies need to be put in place to make a more resilient supply chain? There's an idea floating around about reshoring the production of essential supplies, and that's been growing here in Europe. Some say these concerns are being driven by economic nationalism and exacerbated by the US-China trade war. Others say the crisis has exposed the dangerous dependence Europe has on foreign production. We know a lot of things are going to change as a result of the coronavirus, but some things will not. Consumers will still want low prices, perhaps now more than ever as we enter a recession. They'll also want their medicine as quickly as possible. At the same time, the pressure to maximize efficiency in a recession will be intense. And all of this stuff will be a main focus of the upcoming pharmaceutical strategy for Europe from the European Commission. Now, before we get started, a couple housekeeping notes. As you guys may remember from the last webinar, you will be able to ask your questions to the panelists using the Q&A feature on Zoom that's down at the bottom of your screen. Ask your questions there. Only I can see them, and I'll read them out later on. That's only for questions. If you want to make a comment or maybe insert a link that might be interesting to our guests, you can use the chat feature. You can also engage with the event on social media using the hashtag QuestionsInspireSolutions. Also, you can see it below on my screen. And just for clarity, the purpose of this webinar is not to address questions about any specific products, and that includes recent vaccines. These questions will be filtered out. This is really to talk generally about what can be done to improve the supply chain, the drug supply chain in Europe. So let's start out with some introductory remarks from our speakers. I'd like to first turn the floor over to Simon White. He's Director of Quality Support at Pfizer. Simon?
Thank you, Dave. Do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. Thanks very much for the introduction. And so, yes, let me set the scene with a quick wrap up of the last discussion, the first seminar, and welcome back if you were with us then. And hopefully this time, if you have any questions that we didn't answer the first time, we'll get round to them today, as well as anything you might want to ask following today's presentations. So in the last session, we had speakers from industry looking at how the supply chain and manufacturing processes work, how manufacturing is scheduled to match demand from the markets, and how through the first wave in Europe of this pandemic, we've grappled with the challenges. We had Christopher Schmidt from Merck, who described how manufacturing is coordinated with demand from the markets in some detail. We also heard from Lucas Fischer from Novartis, who discussed the organization of the supply chain itself and how it works, how it can respond to patient demand, and how it can fit allocation of product to market as needed. One of the key points was the geographic diversity of the manufacturing network and how that is one of its strengths, which actually leads to its resilience. And then we had some comments from Alberto Cifuentes and myself from Pfizer, more specifically on vaccine distribution and supply and the challenges that brings. I think the first wave in Europe has demonstrated just how resilient pharmaceutical supply chains are. When we look at what we've experienced this year, it really has put the processes to test. And largely speaking, shortages were minimized. So we managed to maintain supply. Patients received medications as they would normally expect to. Of course, there may always be exceptions, but speaking generally, there were increased number of reports of potential shortages. This is where industry informs the health authorities of a potential shortage, a risk of shortage, but it actually in practice, in most cases, we were able to mitigate those and prevent the shortage from actually happening. So medicines were available to patients. Then the second wave, which we're probably in now, quite clearly, offers or brings new challenges. We'll come back to that. But I think over the first wave, one of the key points we made was how good the dialogue, the consultation between health authorities, particularly the European Medicines Agency, the heads of agencies from European member states, with the marketing authorization holders and the manufacturers. That dialogue has definitely helped processes. We were able to inform each other of new challenges and create that dialogue where the European Medicines Agency could support industry in its processes of getting medicines to patients. Some of the challenges then that the first wave brought were largely around restrictions in movement of product. Restrictions in movement of people was largely overcome, so our colleagues, operators could actually get to their manufacturing sites and distribution centers throughout 2020, this year, to actually keep things turning, could keep manufacturing operating sometimes up to 800% of capacity of normal demand of certain medicines, which is quite an incredible achievement. The prevention of movement of goods, of medicines themselves, with export restrictions and such measures, was an element that jeopardized our ability to get medicines to where they were needed. One of the things that we looked at in the last webinar was how in the normal processes, we have safety stock built in, buffer stock at all stages, from API manufacturing through to finished product, with most manufacturing sites able to continue operating for between 6 and 12 months in normal circumstances, based on the inventory of all starting materials that they keep on hand. And then downstream, distribution centers hold buffer stock, and even down to wholesalers and in market buffer stock at all stages, which it provides in itself a kind of inbuilt safeguard to shortages. as I was saying, in most cases, the potential shortages were actually offset, and we were able to avoid problems at patient level and hospital pharmacy level. One of the things that we touched on was what causes shortages. Setting aside the increased demand due to this pandemic, what we're seeing is that API sourcing is not a significant cause of shortage. There are sometimes delays in processes due to, for example, quality investigations that have to be completed before a batch of medicine can be released. But these, as well as diversion from the market that the product was intended for, with trade to lower cost markets, these are kind of variabilities that are accounted for in today's supply chain processes, largely. So what we're not seeing in this second wave is an increase in demand for the same types, not all the same types of medicines that we saw used in the first wave. And what we as manufacturers, marketing authorization holders aren't entirely clear on is this because the clinical protocol has changed? It's evolving as the medical colleagues gain knowledge in treatment of this disease, or have hospitals, pharmacies, and so on built up their own stock over this summer period. That's becoming clearer now, but we don't yet have a full picture. And we'll come to that in terms of future policy when we talk of visibility of inventory. One of the developments recently was the European Parliament report on shortages, where as manufacturers and marketing authorization holders, we welcome the developments there, with, as I mentioned, free movement of goods, commissioning a study on better understanding real causes of shortage, and giving more responsibility to the European Medicines Agency, which will hopefully avoid differences of opinion, different interpretations between member states, and different practices between health authorities. Other policies that we hope to see would support resilience. Dave mentioned the possibility of reshoring. This, we believe, doesn't necessarily make the supply chain more resilient. As we mentioned, the geographic diversity of the current supply chain, we think, is one of its strengths, which brings resilience in itself. If medicines could be made exempt from border restrictions, specifically within the European Union, that would be a good step forward. And certainly to continue the dialogue, the consultation that I mentioned between we and industry and the health authorities in times of crisis. I think it's clear that dialogue, consultation is necessary more than ever. Better and more detailed forecasting is another element that we might look into. Better epidemiological forecasting based on foreseen clinical usage. Clearly that would depend on the disease we're talking about or the particular epidemic, but that kind of preparation goes hand in hand with inventory visibility, as we mentioned, where the European Medicines Verification System, the EMVS, coupled with the NMVS, which have been put in place since the Falsified Medicines Directive came into effectiveness last February. There's a wealth of data there on the batches released to market, the actual number of packs released to market, how many of those are exported or taken as samples, how many are dispensed. Therefore, what inventory is existing in a market. This is, we think, something that could be leveraged to better advantage. There are some distortive effects in the market. I mentioned trade between markets where the product is taken from the population that it was manufactured for and destined for, and sold in a higher value market. This is perhaps not significant in terms of creating shortages, although it clearly is one source of shortage. But when you take from one population to give to another, clearly you're creating a strain on the supply chain. It adds variability of the normal process of market replenishment. It's also a significant source, by the way, of counterfeits into the legitimate supply chain. Another area is national stockpiles. Not necessarily the right response. It might seem like the right thing to do, but as I mentioned, safety stock is built in all the way through, except in specific targeted cases, specific medicines, there may be a justification, but as a general rule, we don't see that as being a positive development. One thing we saw was in the last few days, a European agency on health security. This seems to be a great positive step. So industry is definitely in support of and willing to partner in that process. So a shortage prevention plan, we'll no doubt discuss a little more. We see that as a more positive effect than the question of stockpiling, but we'll come into more detail on that later in this webinar. So I'll leave it there. Back to you, Dave, unless there are any questions already. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Simon. I noticed that you were talking a little bit about the possibility of giving the European Medicines Agency more powers, perhaps as part of the Commission's review. Could you tell me, I mean, do you think that that's going to be a really necessary ingredient as the EU looks at the framework, that it's really going to be necessary to beef up the EMA's powers in order to improve the supply chain?
Yeah, I think so. I think we see the EMA as a sort of a central body that should be representing the entire European Union, provides one voice for us as manufacturers and marketing authorization holders to have dialogue with. And we do see in various respects, pharmaceutical law interpreted differently in different member states, which is extremely difficult to manage. When you have one European directive, but it's interpreted differently, you potentially have 27 ways of doing the same thing in the extreme. Whereas if the European agency had more sort of influence over harmonizing across member states, it simply makes our life easier of getting medicines to patients, which after all is the key objective.
Yeah, indeed. All right, thanks, Simon. Let's turn next to Marco Farinelli. He's supply chain manager at AstraZeneca. Marco, what are your thoughts on how we can put policy in place that's really going to involve solutions to supply chain problems?
Yeah, so thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I think we need to all address in a way and strengthen on supply chain resilience in the pharmaceutical sector. Not because we don't have it in place today, and I will talk through some slides today around this topic. But more making sure we have a coordinated and transparent approach moving forward when it comes to strengthening further that resilience. So as Simon was mentioning, we had a real life, very, very hard test with COVID as an innovative pharmaceutical industry very recently. And we have come out of that, I would say, pretty well. So as an innovative industry, we could really show how supply chain resilience and robustness could help to support sometimes dramatic increases in patient need and demand. So we want to take this occasion to elaborate and think further based on this real case, what could be potentially some policy options for the future. So again, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I work in AstraZeneca in the global supply chain function, dealing with regional supply chain, but I'm also the vice chair of the EFIA supply chain working group. And today I'm going to give you a perspective which is more of an industry-wide perspective on promoting robustness and resilience of European pharma supply chains. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So as a starter, as an icebreaker, I was thinking, okay, how do I start to project what a supply chain resilience and what a robust supply chain is? Well, just maybe a clarification of terms. Robust means that it can sort of absorb shocks, and that's one thing, but the resilience is that it can adapt to change, and they're both important. And actually, it's a long journey to get a robust and resilient supply chain, which starts year before you ever see a product making it to the market. I just wanted to go through these 4 key concepts here. The first one is that setting up the manufacturing supply chain for medicines actually begins years before it can be used by the patient. When the product goes through its clinical trials, it needs to have a supply chain because you need to supply the clinical material. So you need to start thinking and building your supply chain in very early stages. And there is also some level of, in a way, business risk in this setup, because as we all know, not all medicines make it to approval. So you will see some supply chains that will need to be closed, study closed. But some supply chain, and this is the next element to the right, that will suddenly get to an approval stage. And this is where, from the very beginning, you need to carefully build a robust global supply chain, helping to sort of be able to be scaled up to the increased patient need that it will face once a medicine is registered, approved, and made available to patient. And furthermore, once a medicine gets more into clinical practice, so its need increases, of course, the supply chain you have started to set up in very early phases of development will need to keep scaling up without, of course, providing any issue or any restriction to patient need. So it's a journey which starts very early, and you need to build into your supply chain design a great level of flexibility and robustness. Then there will be different decisions that can be made in this design, but ultimately you may need to add, some manufacturing sites into your supply network as you develop your product, and that's again, it's a sizable decision from an economic perspective, but it's also a long-term investment, because it does require almost 3 to 5 years before a complex biopharmaceutical site can be fully operational. So again, when you design your supply chains for robustness, you cannot live by the day, I would say. You definitely need to have a long-term perspective on, on where your medicine can potentially end, and how your different elements in the supply chain combined together can add value to each other. It's really the supply chain doesn't make sense in itself. I would say the strength of the supply chain is how the different pieces which make it up in terms of different manufacturing sites, for example, different partners to these manufacturing sites, really build that ecosystem, which is, the total sum of the numbers is more than the arithmetical sum of the numbers, I would say. And last but not least, once you have your supply chain set up, being that your own as a company, or being that through a partner who is providing a service for the supply chain, you will need to keep investing into this. So it's really a long-term journey. I mean, these supply chains can be decades long, and you cannot really afford to stop improving in those, to stop investing into new technology. And this is also another important element for sort of robustness and resilience by design. It's not over when you have done it. actually it's never over. You need to keep improving, not only inside everyone's company, but also together with your partner, ensuring you have the right level of quality, the right level of response, and also that we keep meeting and beating, hopefully, increasing environmental standards, which is also a very important objective we are all setting for ourselves in the next years. We can go to the next slide. So this is a little bit the long-term perspective on supply chain resilience. But then what do you do on a sort of day-by-day basis to ensure you have safe, stable, and secure supply chains? Well, for sure, you need to have a robust supply management system that can address issues. So as innovative pharma companies, we definitely have systems and processes in place where we can anticipate demand. So we do demand forecasting. It can be based on historical demand, of course. So there is a statistic behind it, but then it's also it's also linked to estimations around the evolution of a particular disease or patient pool. So you need to have that constant kind of reflection between what is your demand and what the supply data tells you. That's important for a robust supply management system. It's never static. It's always dynamic, and everything starts from making sure your demand and what you can supply is really in balance. And if there is, because there is often a deviation in demand or in supply, then you need to be in control and need to be able to take the right actions to mitigate that gap. And this is really important with this job. You need to have the right risk management plans in place as well. So things can happen, even things that are really out of control of any business enterprise, like, for example, natural disasters. I mean, I come from Italy, and for example, we do have, unfortunately, often earthquakes, which can disrupt the operations of a manufacturing site based in central Italy. So what you need to do in a proper supply chain management is that you have that risk management plan under control. You have options to make sure at the end of the day, the patient, the flow of medicines to the patient is not interrupted. This can mean several things. You can have alternative manufacturing sites or alternative storage locations. You can put strategic inventory reserves along your supply chain. So sometimes, the best inventory reserve, actually, it will depend on your supply chain setup, but the best inventory reserve is not so much at the end of the process, rather it's at the beginning with, for example, API inventories, where you can actually have some more impactful and longer disruptions. So you really need to make sure you have a good risk management plan in place, which you can tap into in case you have major issues which go beyond your demand and supply balancing. And then when things go wrong, there is also a big role to play in having good logistics planning and flexibility in changing shipping routes, for example, from sea to air to expedite some of the timelines, or try to have different routes on the ground to reach basically the location where the patient need is. So that's also important into a robust supply management system. So I would say data, risk, and a great deal also of logistics to really save you in that last mile. Now, through the years, of course, FA companies have been working and are working very closely with European authorities. We do that on constantly reporting data on potential shortages to EU authorities, in discussing with them potential preventing and mitigating actions on shortages. And I think, again, COVID-19 has offered a great test bank for all this. And where actually through COVID-19, we were able, thanks to the close collaboration with European authorities, really to help expedite some of the manufacturing changes that we needed to make sure we were supplying the medicine which was most in need at the time, or making sure we could cover for some gaps that were suddenly being generated by the COVID-19 pandemic in our supply chain. And we have been successful in doing that, also thanks to the help of the European authorities and this open collaboration we had with them. And this has also helped, being an innovative industry, in developing and also, let's say, on the way of making available new diagnostics, treatments, potentially the vaccines. That's what I say, on the way of making it available, right? Because we still don't have an approved vaccine, but definitely the close collaboration with the European authorities has helped to expedite that process by a great deal. So I would like maybe to take the COVID-19 pandemic as the best example to post some reflections on lessons learned. And this is where we can go to the next slide. Because I think that these lessons learned will be helpful when we try to think what's the right policy moving forward if we want to further improve our supply chains. A couple of lessons learned out of COVID-19, which I think are very important. First of all, really being clear and trying to have a harmonized definition of shortage. What we have realized during the COVID-19 crisis is the issue is not if you run out of your medicine in a central warehouse somewhere in Europe. The issue is really if you run out of medicines in a hospital where there is a patient on the bed that needs the medicine. So the first learning is we need to orient ourselves around real patient need, because that's where you see the impact. The impact is not because maybe a warehouse has somewhere in Europe has a low stock. So we need to really keep focusing on having the right definition on shortage and making sure that definition is relevant for the patient. Then another learning we are taking out from COVID-19 is also getting a better analytics and understanding of what are the causes of shortage. There are many causes of shortage. This is really a multifactorial thing when you have a shortage. However, we were trying to think, how can you be more specific? How you can be more data-driven? And this is where our reflection is that we should start to leverage more and more available data repositories on product flows. And one of these actually is the recently went live European Medicines Verification System, which holds data about all the product that we manufacture as manufacturers, and it also holds data about how these products are consumed by the end users. So ultimately by the patients. And this is data available, and this data can help us to probably shed some additional light on the root cause of shortage, which we don't have so far today. A third lessons learned I want to highlight here is that demand estimation we were talking before, right? You need to match your demand with supply and make sure you don't have a gap. Is important. Your forecasting, the ability to forecast demand in the future more accurately is important. And actually, some of the most stressful moments in the COVID-19 wave one were, at least for the innovative industry, were not so much around maybe one of our manufacturing sites not being able to operate. And we got a lot of help there as well. You will see to make sure our sites keep operating. So it was not so much on the supply of the product, but it was more on the huge increase in demand that we had. And in those times, it becomes critical. If you can gain a couple of weeks, see in advance that demand increase a couple of weeks in advance, it can really help you to mitigate any risk of shortage. So again, here is important to work on which are shared together with authorities, which are trusted, which are recognized by everyone. And based on those, and also based on treatment regimens, being able to have a better modeling for future for the forecast of future patient demand. A fourth area of learning was around the solidarity among member states. I mean, this is, I think this is a very important principle in the European Union, and we have actually received a lot of help during wave one crisis. So when you are in a crisis, very often instincts kick in. And this is understandable because that's when you're really stressed under pressure, you need to react very quickly. Instinct kicks in. So what's the instinct? I think in COVID-19 we have learned you go to the supermarket and try to buy some extra food, some extra personal care stuff. And the same went on for medicine. First reaction was, let's try to make some inventory. But actually that's quite a dangerous behavior when it comes to supply chain, because again, you may end up having the medicine in the wrong place where it's not needed. So solidarity among member states and trying to have a European approach is a very important learning in our view from the COVID-19 crisis. We need to balance our instinct, which we all have, with this more sort of bounded rationality. And then the last learning is, as I was mentioning before, how we can facilitate supply. So for example, we had seen a lot of help from European authorities around, for instance, the supply of personal protective equipment to our manufacturing site. So we were able to keep the sites open because we had the instruments to safely do that. For example, that was very important. Or making sure essential workers were able to get to our manufacturing site. So these measures of facilitation of supply, green lanes as well, special corridors, are very important during a crisis. So we need to think about moving forward, favoring this kind of initiatives rather than potentially putting more restrictions into, for example, circulation of goods or people. Now, this leads to my last slide, which is the policy reflection, and we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So, based on this learning, I mean, how would a successful shortage prevention policy? I don't have the policy right here. I think I have some of the principles that policy should be inspired against. And these principles are collaboration and transparency. So we need to keep up the good work on collaboration among supply chain with the European authorities and solidarity between member states that we have seen. But we need to further leverage transparency where that is available. So really having more transparency in the supply chain on information flows, patient needs and demand, potentially stock levels, which are not anymore into a company's control, can really help us to make sure the right medicines gets in the right place where there is a patient. Another principle underpinning a good and sound policy addressing shortages would be that one of collecting facts and data. And you don't collect facts and data overnight. You need to build an infrastructure for that. So for us, it's very important, again, to have a common understanding and definition of shortage. So we understand what kind of data needs to be collected. And then we start to leverage some of the, we start to set up a monitoring system and leverage some of the databases where data is already available, for example, the EMVS for FMD. Because it's only through data and facts that you can establish the right diagnosis. And that's the third point. So before having a policy action, it's important to have the right diagnosis, which is driven by facts and data in a more scientific way. And this is when we can really establish potentially a good view on what are the root causes of a shortage. For example, you need a diagnosis first, which is sort of based on evidence which comes from data. And ultimately, but not the least important, whatever policy we will put in place, because there can be many addressing different aspects of supply chain resilience and robustness, this policy needs to be coordinated. So I mean, we have, we have a great opportunity, really, having, having Europe as such and the EU as an entity. So let's try to refrain from unilateral measures. They won't be optimal. They won't be so powerful like potentially a European measure, which is coordinated across countries. We have seen that really coming through in the COVID-19 crisis in wave one. Unilateral measures were a little bit causing an extra strain for us. And when we had more of a European coordination, that was extremely helpful to, achieve no impact to patient. Now, this was my last slide for the day. So I think we can, Dave, back to you.
Thanks very much, Marco. Super interesting presentation there. I have a follow-up question for you. Some people have said that lean techniques like just-in-time have exacerbated supply chains and caused some problems during this crisis. Do you think that if public policy forced companies to increase inventory holding, would that have alleviated some of the problems we saw in the spring?
Thank you. I think it's a great question, because it helps me to raise 2 points. One about lean and the other one about stockpiling. So definitely, I mean, we have heard, especially in wave one, that lean is kind of dead after the COVID-19 crisis. But I think this is a little bit of a misunderstanding of what lean is. So people tend to equate lean with just in time, but lean is not just that. Just in time is a technique. Lean is more a philosophy where you continuously improve. So I would understand why continuous improvement shouldn't be a way for progress in the future, as it has been so far. And one of the key principles of lean is that it's what gives strength to a supply chain is its responsiveness, and it's not inventory. And actually, inventory can be detrimental for responsiveness, because what do you do if you have a big inventory pile? You usually relax, and this is where inefficiency kicks in. So as I was mentioning before, I think inventory is a very important instrument that needs to be put into a broader risk management plan. And that's a very good use of inventory. And if you put together inventory with lean, you have the right out of stock, but still, which continues to improve, and it doesn't relax and potentially gets ruined.
Well, let's bring in our other panelists now so we can talk some more about these issues. So I'd like to welcome, in addition to Simon and Marco, we have our other EFPIA members. We have Elke Grooten, Head of EU Relations at Novartis, and Christopher Schmidt, Head of Supply Network Operation for Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Russia at Merck. Elke, let me bring you into this discussion, and maybe you could react a bit to what you've heard so far from Simon and Marco, and what do you think are the best policy measures for ensuring robust supply chains?
Okay, so I think both during the previous webinar as well as what Marco and Simon were talking about now, it shows that we take these shortages that affect patients very serious. And some of the ideas were already launched by Marco and by Simon, but I think some of the very constructive suggestions that we have as industry is, we know that the European Commission is performing this root cause analysis, not only looking at the reasons, the reasons of shortages caused by, for example, what Simon was talking about, manufacturing or quality issues, but also throughout the whole distribution chain. And I believe that this root cause analysis is extremely important, because we see that there are many reasons for shortages, and they are very diverse, and therefore targeted solutions are extremely important. One thing I would like to take as a best practice from the COVID wave one is that through the collaboration with the European Medicines Agency and the heads of medicines agencies, we worked on a system on a robust but also responsive regulatory system, so where we can still guarantee the high quality of medicines. We can reduce some of the red tape in cases where we need to move inventory or stock from one place to the other very quickly. So, and then there is, of course, this issue that continues to come up in all the discussions we have with European institutions and also in webinars like this, is that COVID wave 1 showed us that many issues, challenges in the supply are actually linked to unexpected demands. And so we know that industry, as well as together with European Medicines Agency and the European Commission, are working on this, but I see a clear need to continue this great work and to intensify on creating more transparency and predictability on the demand side.
Christopher, what do you think are the main policy tools that people should be looking at for the supply chain?
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here. The main policy measures that we have to look upon, I think they have to be steered toward more and increased cooperation and transparency among national authorities and as well along or with the manufacturers. I think we would have to, as said before, we would have to target really highly critical products that are really based on necessity and based on solidarity and would require a kind of effective collaboration between as well the governments. We need to have the ability to redirect our supplies of pharmaceutical products very quickly between countries and across borders. And for this, we would need a much more and much better forecastability, or improve our forecast, our models that are going along with it, in order to be able to produce and manufacture the products that are actually needed. So bottom line, I would say that we need kind of a increased transparency, and best transparency when it comes to forecast modeling, for instance, would be really to have real-time data. I mean, just click on a button and you know exactly what is happening in the supply chain, rather than talking about true historical data, which very often is misleading us in forecasting and predicting what a future demand is going to be.
Simon, I wanted to ask you, I mean, we've talked a lot about the issues in the European supply chain, but I was also curious about how disruptions in other parts of the world might affect EU medicine supplies. How are issues and supply chain issues happening outside Europe affecting the delivery inside Europe, and what can be done on a policy level to try to get ahead of those disruptions? Simon, are you there? We may be missing Simon. Okay, Marco, I'm going to put the question to you instead. Oh, wait. Simon, are you there?
Okay. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, a company like ours, Pfizer, is a global organization, obviously, like the companies represented by the other speakers today. So probably we have similarities in the sense that we have global supply chains. We have manufacturing sites around the world. So the demand outside of the EU for finished product is, you know, constantly built in to the equation on allocation of product, and clearly the product itself may differ within Europe to the one which is on the market elsewhere. Certainly the labeling, the language, etc., if not the actual manufacturing process. So that balance is part of normal operations, I would say, and you know, ensuring the right allocation of volume based on forecast demand is kind of the daily bread and butter of our organization. So we're highly tuned to the fact that with this particular pandemic, clearly across the world demand was different in different areas and spreading, and there was a risk that for example, the American continent demand would sort of outweigh and cause a problem for supply within Europe, but largely, at least in the first wave, and I think so far it's still the same, we're able to compensate for that. So hopefully that helps answer the question.
Do any of the other panelists have a thought on this issue of global disruptions?
If I can build on Simon's point. Yeah, can you hear me okay? Good.
Yep, we can hear you.
And also building, yeah, great. Also building on one of the questions coming in recently in the Q&A, I see someone was asking around, do we have different lead times according to different supply chain stages? And I think that's quite relevant for the global demand picture as well. I'm going to explain this in a second. So basically, if you look at the supply chain stages, I think you need to kind of think of this in a reverse order. So the longest lead time you usually have on the earliest supply chain stages, like production of active principle, okay? And then you have potentially blending or formulation stages for tablets, which is shorter. And then the final packing stage is the shortest one that you have in your supply chain. That's a mechanical, quite quick turnaround. And when you look at demand, and this is interesting, and this is why I think global supply chains really add value. When you look at demand, if you pull demand together from different countries, you will see that the total demand, the aggregate demand, has a much lower variability than what could be the demand on a specific variant in a specific country. That tends to fluctuate much more. But when you look at the demand going back into the supply chain and you start to, of course, then aggregate it, because the API will be shared by many countries, potentially also outside of the EU, you see that pooling effect really helps you to smooth the demand signal and also become much more accurate with the forecast. So on one side, for me, it's important. One of the values behind the global supply chains is that if you can pool your demand signal across a multitude of markets, you're going to benefit from that pooling effect to smooth supply chain. But the other important thing, which I mentioned in my presentation, is where does it make sense to keep stock? And this depends from demand, but also from lead time. So if you're very quick at the end in packing, you don't want to hold in that stage, the stock that needs to buffer against your potential API risk, right? You want to keep that in an API form to manage that API risk, not at the end of the supply chain, because as demand fluctuates in the different countries, specifically, you may actually have the wrong stock in the wrong place again. Thank you.
Christopher, you might have some insight on this as well. I mean, how are all of these medicine supply chains interconnected on a global scale? How do they affect each other?
Well, I think actually you can answer it with two words: very much. They're very much interconnected. I mean, if we look at global supply chain, and as Mark and Simon just mentioned it before, our companies, or I think the majority of the pharmaceutical companies in Europe, have global supply chains. So we are not having manufacturing sites in each and every country producing individually for each and every country. And as we have heard before, and as we have discussed a couple of days ago on the first webinar, is that the process of manufacturing a pharmaceutical product is a very complex process. And in terms of planning, sometimes needs up to 18 to 24 months. And actually, we're trying within those 18 to 24 months to put a lot of bits and pieces together. And not every bit and piece is manufactured or available in one country and in one specific manufacturing site. So we will have to source. It's a little bit like a car, right? I mean, a car is just not consisting of four tires or four wheels. I mean, you're basically trying to bring things together, and they're not always available in this very specific country where you would like to offer a product to a patient. So we will have to source certain things, and this takes time, and these are connected. And sometimes if one piece is missing, it's not possible to complete the whole supply chain. So it is very, very much interconnected. And I think what is important as well here, I think we have spoken about this one as well, the product that we produce is very, very much regulated. It's regulated, and at the same time, we are offering and we are demanded to have specific quality requirements met. So we wouldn't actually accept every piece or bits or tire or wheel in order to produce our pharmaceutical car or product. It has to fulfill very, very specific requirements with very, very high quality standards. It is interconnected, very, very much interconnected.
Elke, let me ask you a question about diversification, particularly when we're talking about supply chains. I mean, how could diversification help lower the risk of local dependence? And how would that best be approached in a policy framework?
Mm-hmm. I think it's an extremely relevant question, also related to what Chris was just describing. We see that for the moment, different regions across the world are looking into localization or even nationalization of manufacturing, not only of medicines, also of other products, but medicines is one of them. And as was very well described by my colleagues that are experts in supply, actually our manufacturing and our supply networks, they are operating globally. And we have this supply planning and risk management measures in place, like, for example, dual sourcing. And so by having this diversification, by not being dependent on manufacturing and supply from one single location or one single country, we basically minimize the risk of shortages or of dependence on this one country. So having said that, a global network also needs to build on a strong strategy here in Europe, right? Because Europe is part of this global network. And we know that also at the European level, the European institutions are looking into manufacturing, and a very strategic approach and a dialogue around this securing the supply of medicines running is highly needed.
Marco, I have a question for you. I want to go into very much the nitty-gritty of the policy here, and particularly thinking about what the EU is going to be proposing here in terms of the strategy. So what do you think can be done at EU level versus what should be done at national level? What's the ideal split there? And then also I wanted to ask you, in terms of defining shortages, where should that be set? Who should define what a shortage is, and who should legislate what reporting requirements are?
Yeah, so I think on the maybe let me start from the end. So on definition of shortage, I mean, I think my invite is to look into this matter together, you know, from the authorities' perspective. There are definitions already available also at an EU level. Of course, we are aware, but we need to build in some learnings from COVID-19 around that definition. And I think one standard definition potentially globally would be welcome. So for sure, at least at an EU level, it's really, really welcome. So we want to avoid having different definitions in different countries. That would really lead to a lot of confusion. In terms of what EU can do versus national versus specific countries, we always need to think at the pharma supply chain as a strongly globally driven kind of supply chain. Okay, so I think honestly there is value in both. So there is value both in EU level measures and country level measures. But probably we need to look at the geography as being really the EU, because I think in a global landscape, it's much more powerful if you step up as a region into that global landscape rather than an individual country. Even though there is excellence in individual European countries when it comes to life science, when it comes to innovation in manufacturing, there's definitely excellence. I think is more a matter of leveraging that excellence at a European level.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience now. Thanks, guys, for submitting your questions so far. I can tell you're all very much experts out there. These are some great questions. Feel free to keep those questions coming and I can read them to the panelists. So we've got Paolo Mensatieri asking, I think, what is a very pertinent question. Because when we're talking about shortages, one word that the shortages is coming up a lot in right now is Brexit. And of course, not just for drug supply, but for lots of things. But of course, in particular for medicine, especially when you're talking about quick turnaround and just-in-time delivery, this is a big concern, particularly if we have a no-deal Brexit at the end of this year. So Paulo asks, is the uncertainty surrounding Brexit negotiations going to drive national stockpiling in the UK? Who'd like to answer that question?
You want? I can.
Sure, go ahead.
It's a very, very good question. And if there is one journey that accompanied us as a company or as an industry over the last couple of years, actually, it's the discussion around Brexit. And I think one positive thing around Brexit is that we had multiple occasions actually to analyze exactly this question. Is there going to be a stockpiling? Because as you remember, there have been several dates and several deadlines been set. And as soon as we were approaching them as a European Union and the UK, the date was shifted again. So we, at least for Merck, I can tell you that we have not seen these kind of stockpiling activities. We thought every time when a deadline was approaching that there would be stockpiling activities, but we have not seen that. That does not mean that this is not going to happen. So we, very particularly, we have prepared ourselves for this. So we have, based on our risk management approach, defined that there will be provisions for stockpiling activities. For the case of that, for instance, that 1st of January, there is no agreement between the EU and the UK. And people would run to the pharmacies the 2nd of January and start to stockpile product. So we internally were set and prepared for that. But nevertheless, if I were a UK citizen, probably I would already start to stockpile now until the end of the year. And we just don't see that. I don't know how this looks for the rest of my colleagues in the webinar, but at least we don't see these kind of stockpiling activities or spikes in demand.
Have the rest of you seen stockpiling behavior so far in the UK?
Maybe I can step in. This is Marco. If you can still hear me fine, because that's always my concern. Okay, so no, we haven't, but actually, you know, as it was mentioned, we have built in Brexit now really since years, I would say, into our risk management plans. You know, also investing in, and this is like, I would say, a necessary use of inventory, for example. Risk like Brexit is something where part of the measures is not the only measure, of course. It's necessarily down to having some inventory reserves which can be activated considering the uncertainty. Yeah.
Yeah, Dave, I can also confirm this from our side. We have taken the necessary measures and have increased inventory, but until now, as Chris said, we have not seen an increase in demand.
And Simon, what about you?
Yeah, if you can hear me okay. I'm trying to start the video as well. Same, nothing much to add really to the other speakers. especially as Christopher mentioned, this hasn't taken us by surprise. It's been under discussion for 2 or 3 years. So we were able to build it into our planning.
It's very interesting that hasn't been seen yet. We'll see if that continues to be the case. Our next question comes from Gregor Makuch. It's a question for Marco. Do you expect financial incentives from the EU Commission to secure sustainable supply chain also in light of COVID-19?
No, honestly, that's not our first thought. Okay, so we are thinking around a lot around that as an innovative industry, we already have quite a big footprint in Europe. Also, when it comes to API, we have recently done a survey among the EFPIA members, and I think Europe is one of the top regions when it comes to or product supply, I would say, at all the stages in the supply chain. And I think we are already investing into these facilities, being our own or being a partner, because of course we work a lot with the partner. So I think that wouldn't be my my first request back to an EU authority. My first request probably would be more around making sure we have a thriving and innovative pharma manufacturing sector we can leverage the development of our new products.
I want to take a next question from Christine Hutton. I'm pretty sure this is for Christopher. Actually, I'll take 2 questions that Christine has put in here. She says, you already use prospective methods and alert system data. Why is that not sufficient? I think that's for you, Christopher. Let me know if you think that makes sense. The other question here is, do you use global value chain concept and distinction between producer versus consumer driven, or do you prefer global supply chain? Christopher, do those questions make sense to you?
Yeah, makes sense. Christine,
Okay.
First of all, thanks a lot for the question. Great questions. Yeah, sure. We already use a kind of prospective methods or methods that are looking into the future, and we have alert systems. But I think the whole industry, and it's not just the pharmaceutical industry, it's probably part of this industrialization that we all are going through, and this digitalization that we're all going through with whatever kind of product it's never enough. I mean, we use all kinds of data analytics, and we're trying to have artificial intelligence helping us to take decisions. But sometimes we have to challenge the computer as well. We can't just rely on a computer giving us data and to say, like, your demand is going to be 100 in 1 month, so please produce 100. I mean, if somebody would have told us 1 year ago, you have to rely 100% on a computer, I think we probably would not be where we are today. The computer would have never forecasted a pandemic situation like the one that we're having now, and probably would have not been able to actually deal with all these kind of uncertainties and all the kind of demand spikes, and with COVID cases in manufacturing sites and lockdowns, et cetera, et cetera. So I think digital tools are absolutely necessary. They are essential. We have to use these kind of data flows, but I think we have to probably start first somewhere else. And I would love to be much more digital at a complete different end of my supply chain. And that's me now speaking as a regional supply chain head. In most of the countries, actually, in Europe or in my region, most of the customers, or many customers, they still use very, I would say, antique methods of sending us their orders. You wouldn't imagine the amount of paper faxes that in some countries we are receiving. And these kind of things we will have to process in our systems, and we will have to make demand models out of this, et cetera, et cetera. If over the whole supply chain until the end customer, the pharmacy, we would be more digital, I think it would help us much more, us as the human being, in order to take decisions, in order not to solely rely on the computer that is making forecasts. The second question, I don't know if I 100% understand it. So we are global supply chain, whatever you want to mention it, if it's a value chain or if it's a producer against consumer driven supply chain, our supply chain is towards the patient. You can call it value chain. We at Merck, we call it supply network. Actually, it is supply chain, and we are oriented towards the patient, and that's the only driver that we have.
Dave, can I answer also to Christine's question, especially to the first part? So yes, as Chris also explained, we have our systems in place and they're highly optimized to basically do our forecasting. But in specific situation, like in emergencies now with COVID wave 1, you have a certain increase in the need for patients, like for example, infected patients, severe infected patients of certain medicines like ICU medicines. And part of these medicines are also, as we say, off patent. So it means that there are multiple suppliers. So systems to predict demand in normal circumstances that we all have in place and we all have our mitigations plan there. There is also a need to have some transparency outside our own company systems, especially in times like emergencies, when it is of vital importance to get the medicines as soon as possible to the patients that are in need.
Well, I want to go to, we got some excellent, oh yeah.
So yeah, no, if I can, because I really like the it's Marco. Hi, I really like the question around value chains, because I think there is a lot more behind that. So just to mention, I think we are moving. You know, we call them supply chain, but we're moving more and more into value chain, also in the pharma industry. We started to think about patient experience, for example. How can we improve that patient experience beyond the medicine? I think what becomes critical in making, and we're even thinking about supply chain servitization potentially in the future for certain medicines. But what is critical to sort of push the transition towards the global value chain is really pushing the use of data as we digitalize our supply chain more and more. UFMD is the typical example. What are we doing to leverage that infrastructure on one side, and what are we doing to leverage that data to provide more value into our product? So that's, in a way, we are making the transition, but I think we still need some additional help in a certain perspective to fully leverage some of the potentials which are already out there.
Well, in between our two webinars, we got a bunch of great questions by email that were very specific. So thanks for sending those. I want to ask our panelists some of those now. So one person emailed to ask, what share of shortages can be linked to IP products, and what share can be linked to generic products? Is there a difference between those two categories when it comes to shortages? Does anyone want to jump in and answer that?
Yes, I'm happy to take the floor. As most of you know, Novartis is a company that is a market leader both in innovative medicines as in generics. So I think from that perspective, having the systems in place from manufacturing and supply perspective, I hope to be able to give a very good insight in this. So we operate based on the same principles. It doesn't matter if it's an innovative medicine, so a patented medicine, or if it's a generic medicine. However, we see that actually in the off-patent chemicals segment, the dynamics are completely different, right? You are with different, as I mentioned before, you are with different suppliers on the market, like on ICU medicines. So you operate in a completely different perspective. And I mentioned it before, Dave, that therefore this root cause analysis is extremely important, because some measures that might be effective for some products, or in some cases might not be effective for others. For example, if you look at the specific, before I come back to the innovative medicines, if you look at the specificities of the off-patent segment, you know, you're often confronted with, for example, procurement mechanisms. And therefore, the question of Gregor was actually an interesting one that could be thought of, because in procurement mechanisms, we often see that decisions are made purely on price, while companies, like all of the companies present here, they do serious investments in securing supply and things like that. So that's why in for example, procurement mechanisms, having criteria that go beyond price would be very interesting. Coming back to the innovative medicines, I do believe that in that case, what we see is that the frequency of shortages are lower. It is very clear that as it's in one company, it has nothing to do with supply planning, but with what's happening on the market. But we take, of course, every shortage that occurs or potential shortage as serious.
We have another email question, very specific here. What is FPIA's position on the French decree on 2 months of stock for essential medicines? Does anyone want to speak for FPIA's position on that? No, maybe there isn't a position.
It's Simon here. I'll have a shot. We can't really leave it unanswered. You know, I think not only myself, but other speakers have sort of mentioned that the idea of stockpiling isn't really compatible with today's finely tuned supply chains. So this example is France, but you know, we could see other member states following the same path. It can actually jeopardize availability elsewhere. I think, you know, any request for stockpiling needs to be carefully scrutinized, and we could be talking more of a European stock which hasn't gone through its final labeling, so it could be then labeled for any country that needs it. Whereas if you label it for France and you store it in France, somebody has to take responsibility for quality oversight of that inventory, has to ensure proper quality management systems are in place, and to ensure you know, proper rotation of inventory. There is, of course, with a stockpile, a high risk of obsolescence, and you know, none of us want medicines going to waste. You know, what if the label needs to be changed, updated with new safety information, and we have 2 months of stock sort of sitting in a warehouse somewhere? That has to be repackaged, potentially sent back to the packaging site, potentially, all the while using up the product's shelf life. So, you know, I don't think we're in favor of this move. It brings more risk, and it brings a real danger of obsolescence and write-off of inventory of you know, valuable medicine for patients.
Thanks, Simon. Let me take last questions. We wrap up here from the audience. Back to the audience here. We have a question from Randall McGuire. So it's a long question. I'm going to kind of sum it up. But he basically is saying that pharma firms are probably among the most sophisticated firms with the most thorough risk management systems capable, but some other companies in the supply chain might not be as sophisticated. How would you characterize the rest of the supply chain? Often lower level suppliers are not very sophisticated, like in the electronics industry. This is often the case, he says. He asks, do we need to do anything there to catch risks that could materialize that are not that they are not capable of dealing with. So how much of the responsibility here has to go to the rest of the supply chain, and what could the pharmaceutical sector actually even do about those other parts of the supply chain? Who'd like to take that?
Maybe I can try to go first. Sure. This is Marco. Yeah. As an industry, definitely, as I was saying, the supply, your responsibility doesn't end with the ownership of a particular manufacturing site. You know, of course, in case we own a particular manufacturing site, it's ours. But we do, for example, regular audits and reviews of our supply chain partners. Now, these audits have two objectives. One, of course, is to assess the partner, and actually we usually don't engage with partners which are below a certain threshold. We simply don't do that. But one is to assess them to make sure they have a continuous improvement plan in place, because we want them to improve to what is the best standard in the company. So like it would have been our own. And the other one is through these assessments, we detect potential risk, right, that we are trying to improve in the future. But if we have a potential risk here and now, that's what gets built into the risk management plan, of course. So I would say we don't close our eyes on our supply chain partners. That's definitely not the case. Actually, we scrutinize them, we audit them. We give them a hard time, honestly, and sometimes I can tell you we need to exit them for the sake of supply chain resilience and robustness, and we make that decision because quality and robustness and resilience is paramount.
Anybody else want to tackle that question?
Just to support exactly as Marco is saying, I think it's standard across the industry. High level of scrutiny, of quality oversight, we call it in Pfizer, of our partners in the supply chain. So there are no weak links. We don't own our own planes, ships, and trucks, but we have close oversight of our partners in our third-party logistics providers.
Makes sense. Okay, well, let me hand it over to Elke now for some closing remarks on our discussion. Elke?
Thanks a lot, Dave. So first of all, I think this has been an extremely interesting experience for me, and I also believe for my colleagues. We have seen that both today, but also last time, we had a high number of participants. We had a high number of questions also, Dave. And so I do believe, it's not only these webinars that FPI is organizing, there are many other stakeholders that also look at this issue. So it's a very, very important issue. And as I said, we take it very serious. I do hope that during these two events, we managed to show you and also make you more aware of the systems that we as companies have in place when it comes to our supply planning and also business continuity and risk management plans. And we have said it so many times during the last hour and a half, but the collaboration is so key. The collaboration with the European institutions, with the national authorities, with other stakeholders in the distribution chain of medicines. If I may maybe try to summarize some of the nice policy suggestions from my colleagues during this webinar, especially now that the Parliament is very actively looking into this issue, but also we're expecting the European Commission to come out with a pharmaceutical strategy where this will be a key issue, right? I think, as Marco said very clearly, there is this need to work on a clear and a harmonized definition, and also on harmonized reporting requirements. My colleagues from supply often say that we have a very automized system to basically monitor our expected shortages and unfortunately sometimes shortages. However, because of the reporting requirements being so different, there is a very resource intensive process afterwards to do the individual reporting in the different member states. So there is certainly some improvement and harmonization that can be done there. Then it's, as I mentioned, a better understanding of the root causes and then have targeted solutions together. This will also help in having a more effective approach, having a strategic dialogue on security of supply rather than looking at short-term measures to avoid shortages like stockpiling or penalties, which are actually counterproductive, as was also showed by my colleagues. And what we also believe, some of the countries, in some especially smaller member states, for medicines that are sensitive for potential shortages and are critical for continued treatment of patients, there are some measures in place for potential movement of goods, for example, due to parallel trades. However, we very often see that these measures are not always enforced. And then we fully acknowledge that there is sometimes a need to have some specific measures on shortages, and we would call upon very specific and temporarily targeted emergency measures on a country level. So with that, Dave, I would like to thank again all my colleagues and also the audience. I enjoyed very much this discussion, and I hope the same for you.
Thanks, Elke. Yes, I definitely learned a lot during these two discussions, especially as somebody not, intimately involved with the pharmaceutical sector. It's been really, really interesting, especially at these times when these issues are affecting all of us. So I want to thank the panelists for some great contributions and the audience for some great questions in both of the webinars. And yeah, we'll see where this issue goes in the coming months. Thanks, everybody, and I wish you a great evening.